Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Joey Wender, the Executive Director of the Shelby Coalition. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to today's webinar entitled BEAD, USF, and Tariffs, What to Expect. I'm also joined on this webinar by Kristen Cora, Shelby's Great Policy Counsel, who will co-moderate this webinar with me. Over the past couple months, we have heard from so many Shelby members with the same question: what will the new tariffs mean for broadband deployment, network maintenance, and the supply chain? And even before we know what exactly will be the final level and extent of the tariffs, what impact is the ongoing uncertainty already having on the broadband industry? That's why we've invited two outstanding industry leaders to give their perspectives on tariffs. We first welcome Blair Levin, whose esteemed career includes serving as Chief of Staff to FCC Chairman Reed Hundt, authoring the National Broadband Plan, and currently serving as policy analyst at New Street Research, and reminded me that his most important job is grandpa. We also welcome Marissa Mitrovich, who's the Vice President of Public Policy at the Fiber Broadband Association, whose vast experience in the telecom space, including at Verizon, Frontier, and WEA, will help us better understand the current state of play. Before we start, just a couple reminders and logistics. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website afterwards. Audience members are muted, but we encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box, to send your questions. And as always, you can follow us on social media at Shelby Coalition or hashtag Shelby Webinars. Also, we want to thank our corporate sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, Cisco, and Tirana. We would not be able to engage our work without their financial support. All right, so it's time to turn to the issue at hand. So Blair, we're going to go to you first. Where are we right now? And how should we be understanding tariffs?
So in my Wall Street work, I've been writing about the possibility of tariffs since the fall. And in the fall, I would say most investors thought that there was zero chance that Trump would do what he said he was going to do because it made no economic sense. And I kept saying, this isn't about economics. This is about psychology, power, dominance, leverage, deal making. I think that's where we're at. There's not a rational economic policy, to be candid. They have articulated several different goals: raising revenue, reindustrialization, fairer trade deals. Those things all contradict each other. We're in a somewhat chaotic period where we're now in various 90-day pauses. So I think that there is an uncertainty about where we are now and where we're going to be. I will just, for the purposes of kind of highlighting in the intro, I will say that when we think about these things in terms of the Shelby audience and the policy issues we're talking about, there are two very distinct categories we need to think about. One is the impact on the macro economy, and what does that do to folks? What does it mean if we're in a recession or a very low growth period where we also have inflation? We may not be quite at the stagflation level, but we have this combination of increased prices with slower growth, and you have the problem there, and that so the price points affect industry in a variety of ways. And then the second is the more micro, which is what is the impact on the people who deploy networks, as well as the customer's ability to buy devices, both the laptops and the phones. And we can talk about the details of those, but that's the rough category. It's going to be chaotic for a while. I go on lots of panels where people say you can't predict the future, and I always say, yeah, maybe not, but Wall Street's been paying me for more than 2 decades to do that, and I'm very grateful they don't think the same way, because I'm always making predictions. Some of them are right, some of them are not. But there are moments where you can make the prediction, but you have to have a pretty low level of conviction about the nature of that, and that's where I think we're at, which is we can predict where we're going to be in July and August, and Lord knows lots of people are doing it and making big bets based on it. But it's hard to have much conviction. And the fundamental point is that the companies cannot really make plans for capital investments going forward until this is all clarified as to what the long range framework is going to be.
Thanks, Blair, for that intro. Marissa, let's turn to you for an opening thought on where are we and how this is affecting, more specifically, your members and your stakeholders who are deploying and installing and manufacturing fiber for tens of billions of dollars of deployment, both from private money and federal money.
Thank you for having me, Joey and Kristen. It's great to be with you and with Blair today. Just tables that I want people to know, the Fiber Broadband Association, we have 600 members. We represent manufacturers and providers of broadband. And when you think of that, about those manufacturers and those providers, it's co-ops, it's tribes, it's large ISPs, it's CLECs, and so it's this very large tent of members. So when I'm speaking to this, I'm taking both of those sets of members into account. But as Blair said, predictability is really the word of the day, right? The message of the day that we're looking for. There are multiple inputs that we are thinking about right now outside of tariffs, grant timelines, affordability, the onshoring that's already happened, and commitments, as you said, billions of dollars from our membership. And what we need is a roadmap to allow our industry to move forward smartly and strategically. And so, as Blair said, we can talk further about what that actually looks like. But predictability is what the most important message I can start us off with.
Thank you. I'll open, and then Kristen has got many questions. Blair, let's dig in. Both of you dig in a little bit more about BEAD, right? Obviously, BEAD is the $42 billion question. One of the major questions, but this is the $42 billion question that's sitting before us. There's obviously, I think Marissa is right. We have major questions about timeline. But let's also talk about the tariffs themselves and the price of these goods and the cost of delay and the cost of this uncertainty we'll have in deployment and what that means for the type of technology that is being put on the ground or the type of technology that's connecting homes, right? And the extent to which, I would say the extent to which BEAD dollars can extend as far as possible. We'll start with Blair.
Okay. So first of all, in terms of timing, as I think everyone in this call would know, in February, March, and April, the Department of Commerce staff, well, first of all, in February, Secretary Levin said, we're going to give a rigorous review. We're not going to send any checks out, even to the states that have already been approved by us, because we're just going to hold off and do this rigorous review. And the staff was telling the states May 16th is the target date. I wrote a note for Wall Street about a week ago, maybe, saying it ain't going to be May 16th. That what we're hearing from staff is now look to June, maybe even July, for that review. Lutnick himself has been tied up on the tariff stuff. And further, from what I can understand from staff, they're kind of just waiting for him to say, what does he want? What I've told investors is there are a number of different options, but I think the two most significant choices are, number one, say that there's a bunch of conditions that the Biden people imposed on the BEAD process. You cannot, the states can't enforce them. You can't enforce DEI, you can't enforce workforce requirements, et cetera. If that's all that they do, it's fine. There are 46 states, I think, that either have completed or are close to completing their bidding process. They just want to have those in the contracts. It'll be fine. I mean, you could argue about it, but that'd be fine. The more difficult challenge, which is clearly where they're leaning, whether they end up there or not is an interesting question. But they are leaning toward having all the states rebid with those requirements taken out, but also with a high cost threshold that is designed to shift funds from fiber to satellite. And that will cause increased delays, estimates of 6 months, 12 months, even 18 months. So let's call it a year, because you have to do lots of stuff. And it's not just the states, it's all the stakeholders have to revise their thinking about these things too. So that can cause significant delays. And when you have delays, and Joey, you know this really well, you got a lot of money out when the price of deployment was a lot less. So that 42 billion became more like 36, and maybe 32. And if we wait another year to deploy it, it's going to affect it even more. And then if you add the tariffs, which we can talk about, you're adding even more costs. So that's where I think the state of play is. The one other thing I'll simply add on BEAD is I think the political pressure is growing not to force the states to rebid. More and more states are speaking out. Republican senators, Capito and some others, are saying, just let the state finish the job. I don't know that Lednick cares. He clearly shows that he cares a lot about the audience of one, which is to say Trump, and occasionally the audience of two, which is Musk. And so that's, politically, I think the easier thing to do is let the states go forward. But if you had that analysis, you would have already done that, because the Trump team, which so bitterly criticized the Biden administration for causing delays, now has caused very significant delays. So that's where I think we're at.
Marissa, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, so I want to respond to a few things. First, I'll start with, so I have a different line of thinking about the timeline that we're looking at right now and the delay. From the perspective of, it's a new administration. I think if I was going to take over an organization, which it's so it's all brand new, you want to learn what's going on within that organization. You want to look under the hood. You want to see what's actually happening. And so I do think, based on outreach the fiber broadband associations received and what I've from the administration, NTIA, the White House, I do think they're looking at all aspects and all elements of the program. I'm cautiously optimistic that, with even the implementation of a tech neutrality rule, there will be a mix, and fiber will still have a strong place in that mix. From conversations I've had with people in the administration and on Capitol Hill, things I've heard, I do believe there's an understanding of the importance of getting a critical infrastructure deployed with these BEAD funds. And yesterday night, I was as I was going to bed, I was reading the Department of Transportation Secretary talking about the FAA and what was happening in New Jersey and how they need to now recreate an entirely new technology network, which needs to be fiber broadband. So I'm coming from a different perspective. That said, I agree with Blair that, the delays are the biggest obstacle right now. And whether, I hope the political pressure is great enough that we will see the program move sooner rather than later, that there's going to be some upsides. We hope we see some upsides there from some of the reforms that will come out of this. And there could potentially be, and I can talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but downsides. The downside right now, though, is just the timeline and that we're delayed in the program. But from I do think this administration, and they've articulated this, believes that they want a strong economy, they want to create jobs, they want onshoring, they want investment in America. And that's what the deployment of a technology like fiber creates.
So can I just offer a couple of responses? First of all,
Of course.
if you listen to what Donald Trump said on the Joe Rogan show in October, he said satellite is better than fiber and it costs nothing. Now, those two facts are wrong, but what matters is not what the truth is. What matters is, what does Trump believe, right? And so when you say they've articulated these things, they articulate lots of different things. I think, it's very confused as to, sure, you want a strong economy. What what economist thinks tariffs will lead to a stronger economy, right? I mean, there's multiple contradictions. I would love to believe that the reason we have this delay is that there is a very serious, dramatic review about what to do. My fear is, and I have enormous respect for NTIA, the staff, is that the only reason for delay is Howard Lutnick doesn't have the time to actually focus on the issue. And therefore, we're just sitting around waiting for him to get off his tariff duty and to make a decision. And that when he makes a decision, it will not be, you know, here's part of my resume that nobody remembers, thank God. One of the things I had to do when I was chief of staff at the FCC was cut 10% of the staff. It was extremely painful. It took me about 14 months to figure it out. Talked to lots of people. This is in contrast to the chainsaw Doge approach, and which is just cut, right? And not really care about the consequences. And the reason I mention that is if Lutnick is doing a serious job, great. If he's really looking at all the issues you're talking about, great. But if he's just going to say, at the end of the day, the president thinks satellite is perfectly fine, we're just going to figure out how to spend as little money as possible and give money back to the Treasury and spend it all on satellite, not so fine, right? So, and that's my fear. And you would be in a better position to know what the reality is. But as far as I can tell, the NTIA staff has no idea what Lutnick really wants to do. I hope I'm wrong.
I hope the same, Blair.
Kristen.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I do see some questions coming in the Q&A. So please, if you all have questions, please post them in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them. So let's now go back to looking at tariffs a little bit more directly and specifically on the broadband sector. So are there specific equipment components that are critical to broadband deployment or maybe maintenance that would be specifically targeted by these tariffs?
So I think the answer is yes. I would note that what you might think of as the ISP industry, the telecoms and the cable industry were among the least affected in the early weeks of April. And the reason is that, you know, in terms of their build out, they've already built out significantly. It's just a service. People aren't going to cut off their service no matter what happens in the recession, et cetera. In terms of new deployments, labor is a huge cost. I think it's like 70%. And that obviously is not tariff. And then you have the cost of the conduit, and a lot of that is made in the US, so that's not tariff. So you're really dealing with a relatively small percentage of the overall costs that are made abroad. This was actually an issue in the early days of the BEAD program, and Joe, you probably dealt with this, where the Biden administration had what was called BABA, which is Buy America, Build America, I guess. And the Biden administration successfully got firms like Nokia to build certain of the equipment. So where we are now, I think, is that there is certain equipment that is very difficult to replicate the supply chain, but it's a relatively small cost. It's absolutely essential, but it's a relatively small cost of the overall deployment. So it's, you know, you might think of equipment at most it's 20%. It's probably significantly lower. And so it's the tariff on top of that. So in terms of the overall impact on the cost of deployment, it's in the single digits.
So I would caution that we should, and Blair, you did a great job going through multiple components of the network, and I know you're familiar with exactly what goes into this, but I would caution we have to be careful about what the specific inputs are and how it really will impact. I know from our members' perspective, you know, there's no one size fits all approach to managing these tariffs, and our members are still assessing how this will impact their own direct supply chain. So whether it's a company like Nokia, who already committed to onshoring and has spent billions of dollars to move operations to the United States, more locations than they had, more manufacturing than they were doing, or a fiber manufacturer like we have all 5 of the manufacturers, US manufacturers in our and our membership portfolio. And so I think what we wanted, from where I sit, there is a lot that's been onshored. There are a lot of components that are available and maybe won't be impacted as seriously as others, but also, and now I don't want to conflate them because they're two separate things. As we talked about BEAD, which is really where we're focused, a lot of the compliance that our companies have made and have gotten to is because they wanted to comply with this BEAD BABA waiver. And that's a different approach than just because it's the way they came up with these formulas, and they spent so many hours over with NTIA talking through, and I hope someone has the notes because I know the hours spent, and I certainly was one of the people spending hours going through the different elements of the network with them. There is a certain formula to it, more so than just 55% US made, 45% can be made somewhere else. And so I think we have to be thoughtful too. I know I recognize you're talking about specific components, but there's just so many other criteria that are impacted. And so you're right. Our members have said, in the beginning, they weren't certain, it had been minimal, but they also are now looking at this saying, we're not sure, and who absorbs the cost, and how does that, ultimately impact us? Do we absorb it? Do our customers absorb it? Does that go to the subscriber at the end of the day? I mean, I think there's a mix is the reality, somewhere in the middle, but certainly things we're still thinking about, and how severe is that?
Yeah, no, excellent. I'm glad you guys brought up BABA because that was, specific to the BEAD program early on. And I know that came with its own challenges and requirements. And so now it kind of seems like we have to shore both of these up together. So I appreciate that. One of our attendees asks, this is a little bit in the same vein. I know we've been talking about different components, but there's also potentially an element of different types of organizations or participants, specifically in BEAD. The question here is, what impact do you think these tariffs will have on smaller ISPs, or maybe minority-owned providers who already operate on tighter margins and limited resources? Anybody want to opine on that particular line of questioning?
Well, the obvious answer is it's going to hurt them more. And one thing you see already in the economy is that as to the large publicly traded companies, the expectation in the market is they can weather the damage. They're worth approximately what they were worth 6 weeks ago, that kind of thing. But there is not a good market for the literally millions of small businesses that are being affected by tariffs. And there are two different elements to that. One is that when you look at the products that are most affected, which let's just call it T-shirts or pencils or dolls coming from China. I don't know why those things came to my mind. Those are largely distributed by small retailers, and they're dramatically affected. It's not reflected in the stock market, but now they're really being hurt. But the second thing is that, big companies it's like a big battleship. You can survive these various waves, where if you're in a small boat, one big wave can capsize you. And so for the small ISPs, the margin of error is so much smaller. And so whereas I can say, as I do with the investment community, relying a lot on the work of my colleagues, it's not good. There's nothing good here, but it's not going to be that bad. And there's a possibility of some kind of return. If you're small, you can't, you could really be hurt badly by it.
Marissa, anything to add?
I agree with what Blair's saying. And yes, I mean, certainly we are hoping to see there's 1,900 fiber providers. I was having a conversation this morning. And so you just think about that. And we want to see so many of these fiber providers succeed. They've made commitments. We know that consumers want this technology, right? And we know consumers want broadband, reliable, high-speed broadband right now. And so anything like these tariffs and this uncertainty, smaller providers are going to be impacted much more greatly. So,
Okay. Before we started this call, I know Blair was bringing up the current litigation around everything in relation to tariffs. So, Blair, why don't we circle back around to that? Do you want to give folks an update on where that stands?
Sure. So there are, I believe, 7 different cases that have been filed challenging the legality of the Trump tariffs. The basic argument is the 1977 law, which is referred to as IEEPA, because everyone in Washington, I can't even remember what it really means, but we have to use acronyms. So the IEEPA never mentions tariffs, but gives the president authority to do certain things if there's a national emergency. California has filed its own case. There are 12 other states that have filed cases. Yesterday, the first substantive oral argument occurred in the International Court of Trade up in New York, 3-judge panel. I'm not comfortable predicting the outcome based on that argument, as the judges seem to have problems both with the plaintiffs, who are arguing that the law doesn't really authorize the president to do this, and also problems with the president's lawyer. In both cases, what the judges seem to be saying is, what is the limiting principle of what you're saying? In other words, if you're the plaintiffs, it does give the president a lot of authority, but where do we draw the line to say you can go this far and not any further? And they were kind of asking the same question of the president's lawyer, and at one point mentioned, are you suggesting that if there's a shortage of peanut butter, the president can argue that, that's a national emergency? To which I, of course, said, of course it's a national emergency, but I'm not sure it's a national emergency that justifies tariffs. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, there will be a series of these cases. There's another argument next week with the other states. One interesting aspect of this is the cases are being brought and litigated by some very conservative forces. The lawyers, I believe, yesterday were essentially they're part of a public interest group that is being funded by Charles Koch and Leonard Leo. People on this call may know Charles Koch is a longtime libertarian, very conservative, very large funder to politics. Leonard Leo, Donald Trump thinks he owns the Supreme Court. I think he may be renting it. I think Leonard Leo, if anyone owns the Supreme Court, it's Leonard Leo, who has helped all 6, not just 3, of the Republican-appointed justices get there. I'm saying that slightly in jest, but people who know who Leonard Leo is know he's a very influential, important figure in jurisprudence in the United States. So it's a really interesting combination of traditional conservatives with liberal folks like the governor of California arguing against this. The case may well go to the Supreme Court, but there's a lot of conservative arguments for why Trump should not be allowed to impose these tariffs under this law. There are other laws which would require it, but I think by the time we get to that, that's just too difficult for Trump. The reason he likes this law is it didn't require process, it didn't require an investigation, and we'll see where we go. But I think that's a real wild card, because you could have a court in the relatively near future simply say, not authorized to do this, and then suddenly the tariffs all go away.
All right, thank you so much. Blair, you just brought up states, and so that we've talked about, internet service providers and manufacturers and how these tariffs might implicate them and, the challenges they face. What about state broadband leaders? Are they, reevaluating their BEAD implementation plans? Considering any disruptions to supply chains? Are they, sort of wondering themselves about the challenges that any of these tariffs, might bring to their own deployment plans?
I've been thinking a lot about the famous Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's also a hierarchy of crises. I believe most of the state broadband offices are much more concerned about what is going on with BEAD, also what's going on with the digital equity grants, things like that. So tariffs are a concern, but much lower on the scale, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Blair. I think there's a lot of other issues they're concerned with right now. However, it does get to the point that as they're thinking about these proposals that they've spent so much time working on already, and there is a metric, we talked about it briefly, the extremely high cost threshold and the cost per area and location. I mean, we certainly want to make sure that that's high enough that you can deploy reliable, high-speed internet that's sustainable, that is going to last, iterations through the future. And so anything like tariffs would have to be something that they're thinking about, especially if they're going back to look at these programs. And again, we don't know, we can't predict. Blair and I have different thoughts on what's going to happen, but neither of us are the Secretary of Commerce or the President of the United States. So we are sitting along with everyone on this call and in the industry, waiting to see how that goes. But I think right now the states have spent a lot of time doing really good work and are just hoping to protect a lot of what's already in place, because we don't want to recreate the wheel. We don't want to have to go back to the drawing board. We've already spent a lot of time thinking about these plans.
I mean, just extending this line of questioning for a second. So let's assume states are able to proceed, right, under sort of the original conception here, right? Does later tariffs or just the uncertainty that exists now increase the odds of defaults later on by providers? One of the big fears, having just ran a large broadband program and been in the admin looking at how we're connecting all homes and businesses in the United States, the worry, and obviously thinking about RDOF as well, the context of that, right? You don't want businesses are making predictions, or providers are making assumptions about what the cost of the inputs are, labor, the widgets, right? What does it all cost? And if you're changing one of the costs during the deployment, does it increase the odds of potential default later on, which leaves us in a different type of mess when certain homes and businesses are not connected because the provider walked away?
Yeah, the answer is yes. Look, and you know this part well, and all of us who have been involved with the FCC's efforts to fund people know this well. It's a real challenge, because once the government has committed money to an entity to build out in a certain place, if that entity comes back and says, oh, yeah, we were going to do it and we were going to do it in 3 years, but it turned out there was a labor shortage and there was this and inflation went up, so it's going to take us 4 years, but no problem, right? Well, the problem is, how do you punish them? You could fine them, but that doesn't really help that community. You could say, well, we're not going to give you any more money, but then what happens? You have the sunk cost. So enforcing the build-out commitments has long been a huge problem at the FCC. And there are various different mechanisms, and BEAD has them, you had them, to try to attempt to do this, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But there is no question that any disruption to the macro economy will absolutely come downstream and cause this problem to be much bigger in a couple of years.
Kristen, what other questions do we have from the audience?
Sure. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask, and I'll look at the Q&A here in a second, are there any alternatives to tariffs that are being considered? Or is this just what's been put on the table and that's that?
Well, as the president would say, that's a stupid question and you should be ashamed for asking it. Tariffs are the most beautiful word in the English language. Trade wars are short and easy to win. So the answer is no. Certainly there's nothing in Congress that is being thought about. there is an interesting debate in the Democratic Party about whether there should be a full-on assault on the president's tariffs policy, or whether it should be more nuanced, like let's have more strategic tariffs or something like that. We could argue about all that, but at this point, it's in the hands of the president and Secretary of Treasury, and other people in his camp, and who knows? As we saw with the executive orders against the law firms, if you assume that everybody capitulates, it's great. You can force a lot of actions that you like. I think they're horrible, but if you assume they capitulate, but if they don't capitulate, and I would argue China did not capitulate, it's not clear to me what the United Kingdom did, but I don't really know what we want in either of those things, and yet somehow we declare victory. But that is much more the game than kind of the strategic economic analysis. Where are the businesses that are based in the United States limited in their opportunities in ways that are unfair to us? I don't see that kind of process happening at all.
Marissa, just giving you a chance to weigh in if you'd like.
And I don't want to be too cute on this, but what I will say is I will plug again something that will stimulate the economy and will create jobs, is getting the BEAD program going and certainty around that. So they're apples and oranges, but as far as what they both will do and both are intended to do, I think that is where my focus certainly is.
And just to acknowledge from Shelby's perspective, like, we agree, right? I mean, the BEAD program, there are many benefits of large scale deployment programs. Obviously, not just in the short run and the jobs are created in the deployment, but the long-term economic benefits of connecting homes, businesses, and anchor institutions. And we talk about it all the time at Shelby. What are the benefits of high-speed broadband for schools and preparing our children for the 21st century economy? What are the benefits for libraries, ensuring that people have a place to go, to apply for work, to access medical care, obviously to take classes? And then it's clear on the healthcare side, these are life-saving, life-saving, literally, technologies. The need for high-speed broadband and high capacity does save lives in rural areas. So I had to make, Marissa, you set the plug up for me, and I had to take it. So we agree wholeheartedly.
Can I add a couple of things?
Yeah.
Taking off my Wall Street hat and just putting on my advocacy hat. You're 100% correct. This is part of the argument for why fiber is much better than satellite. Satellite helps individual homes. Fiber helps communities and economic development. Right now, Congress is considering legislation that will eviscerate rural hospitals. That's a horrible thing. I completely disagree with it. Okay, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm going to make is, if you do that, you better give rural folks a lot of bandwidth, because the way they're going to be accessing medical care is through the internet. I actually wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal saying, this was in December, DOE should shut down offices for Social Security, for Veterans Affairs, for labor. There are thousands of federal offices. A lot of people disagree with me, by the way, but I'm just saying, here's the deal. Shut down those offices, save a lot of money, but take that money and put it into broadband deployment, broadband adoption, in other words, making sure it's affordable, and also broadband utilization. Because people actually would rather have, instead of 9 to 5 Monday through Friday where they have to go to an office, most people would rather have 24/7, 365, 366 in leap years, access to web-based customer service, which is what these entities offer. But that's not where we're going as a country. It's where we should be going, but it's not where we're going. And you see these massive contradictions in these policies, which are taking away services at the very time, or delaying services at the very time we should be accelerating getting them out there.
That's right. And also affordability, which we touched on at the top, but haven't really gone further on. Another critical component of is being able to adopt broadband. And to all the points you just made, Joey and Blair, we do need to come up with a solution for adoption, especially in the rural communities, especially in the areas that are grant funded, that there hasn't been a case for private investment because the networks they can't build it and sustain it due to adoption rates. And so that's another area where, and from FBA's perspective, whether it's USF reform or an ACP type program or a lifeline, it doesn't matter. What we need is a sustainable, viable option as we think about adoption.
Well, listen, this was, you both teed up and you're leading right to it, Marissa, is I think it all underscores the need for the rural healthcare program right now and the E-rate program. We shouldn't be turning our, as there some have started to suggest that they're no longer necessary. I think both of you are arguing that they're actually more necessary today, probably than ever, right? The need for rural healthcare clinics and for high-speed capacity into these clinics is more and more essential. As you know, specialists, I hear all the time from our members, this is how rural Americans access specialists who live in urban centers, right? This is how they connect to them, is through the internet, is through telemedicine. And so taking away that funding or thinking about decreasing it, I think moves us in completely the wrong direction. We're going to wrap up here. Marissa, 30 seconds, any final thoughts? And then Blair, 30 seconds, final thoughts.
Thanks for having me, Joey. Great conversation. Predictability, we really are working for it. We want to see fiber deployed to every American, and we are at the table ready to have conversations to make it happen.
Thank you. Blair.
Joey, again, thanks for inviting me. Great to participate in this. And look, I think there's a really important point here, which it is only through coalitions like Shelby and the Fiber Association that the people in power actually, and A, that they understand what's going on, and B, that they feel pressure to do the right thing. So I wish you all the best in convincing them that they should actually focus on doing the right thing rather than focus on, I don't know, doing the thing that one of their major campaign contributors said they should do.
Well, Blair, Marissa, and our Kristen, thank you so much for participating here today. We have come to the end of the webinar. Also want to thank our sponsors, Ready, Zayo, T-Mobile, Cisco, and Tirana for all of their support. Also a reminder, if you've enjoyed these webinars, please consider becoming a Shelby member. Shelby is the leading national advocate for affordable, high-speed internet for anchor institutions and their communities. And if you're already a member, please recommend that your colleagues join Shelby as well. Finally, even though it's only May, it's time to talk about AnchorNets. So we want to encourage everyone to attend AnchorNets. It's the leading broadband conference for anchors. This year's conference will be held October 29th through 31st here in DC. So we encourage all of you to register today. With that, we will end this webinar and stay tuned for future webinars. And again, appreciate so much our two panelists for their excellent contributions and insights. Take care, everybody.